everybody. I hope you're ready for chapter 4. Now you might notice I've got a very special guest for our story today. This isn't Barnaby from the story, but he'd like to play the part. So let's get started. Chapter 4, in which Barnaby goes to the Saturday races. The next morning, early, I went down to the lockup in my dressing gown and fed Barnaby his hay. He ate like a horse. I just hoped he would run like one too. I came back afterwards and ate my own breakfast in silence. Mr. Skip was watching every mouthful of toast and strawberry jam as it went in. Mum tried her best to cheer me up, but it was no use. I could see it all in my mind. I could hear it all their prancing, dancing ponies tossing their heads at the start line, pawing the ground, then dashing off into the distance. The crazy Cossacks' mocking laughter ringing in my ears, and the miles behind, barely able to get old Barnaby to walk. Mum was at the fridge fetching some milk when suddenly and quite definitely Mr. Skip began to chuckle. She turned around, so surprised that she nearly dropped the milk carton. "What was that?" she said. "My tummy, Mum," I said. "It's my tummy rumbling. Nerves. I'm awful nervous." The chuckling stopped, thank goodness, as Mum came back to the table. "It'll be all right, Jackie," she said, stroking my hair. "Don't you worry yourself." Then she sat down and patted Mr. Skip on his head. I do love my birthday present. Always smiling he is, no matter what. It's almost like there's 3 of us now, 3 of us against the world. I knew it would make no difference, but before I took Barnaby out, I groomed him till he looked a little bit less like a dirty old carpet and a little bit more like a new one. I picked out his feet, brushed his tail and stroked his ears. He always liked me to do that back at Gran's. The last thing I did inside the lockup was to whisper in his ear, "Please, Barnaby, just for once in your life, go fast like the wind. Please, please." Then I led him out of the lockup, out onto the green where they were all gathering. And I mean all. Everyone on the estate must have been there, and I knew why. They all knew by now that Barnaby was going to run in the big Saturday race, and they'd all come for a good laugh. There was always a good turnout for the Saturday race. It was a well-known event. People would come from miles around to see it. But I'd never in my life seen a crowd like this. There must have been hundreds of people milling around, thousands even. And all the crazy Cossacks' ponies and horses were racing up and down, showing their paces. Barnaby just stopped dead. He didn't like what he saw at all, any more than I did. I smoothed his neck and patted him. "It'll be all right, Barnaby," I whispered. But then the crazy Cossacks spotted us. They were pointing at us and eeyoring, the whole horrible lot of them, except Barry, who, to be fair, did look a bit shamefaced. The whole crowd seemed to be laughing. I felt like turning tail and running. But suddenly, Mum was there beside me, leading out Barnaby with me. And all the while she was waving to the crowd like we were coming into the winners' enclosure at the Irish Derby. Mum was brilliant, utterly brilliant. Very soon they weren't laughing at us anymore. They were clapping instead. Then they were cheering. Barnaby knew it too. He was suddenly enjoying it. He was up on his toes, his ears pricked forward. At one point he even broke into a brief little trot. I could hardly believe it. It made me feel a whole lot better too. All right, so we would come in last, I knew that, but at least people would be cheering us and not laughing at us. That would be enough for me. It was my fault that Barnaby sat down. When the race started and the others went galloping off, Barnaby was just left standing. And all I did was give him the gentlest of kicks with my heels to get him going. A little tickle, that was all. "Go!" I shouted. I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have said it. I knew well enough that if you kick Barnaby on, he sits down. He'd done it to me dozens of times when I was at Gran's place on holiday, but I forgot, I suppose, or I just didn't think. Anyway, he sat down and I slid off the back of him, and I sat on the ground feeling very stupid and very angry with myself for being so stupid. I expected everyone to laugh, but they didn't. I think maybe they felt sorry for me. Mum helped me up and said it didn't matter one bit, that I'd soon catch up with the others. Once up on Barnaby again, I took the reins and looked up ahead of me. There wasn't a horse in sight. I felt like giving up, but something inside me made me do what I should have done in the first place. You don't tell Barnaby what to do, you ask him nicely. "Please, Barnaby," I whispered in his ear. "Please, do it for Mr. Skip." Well, that did it. It was as if some hugely powerful electrical charge suddenly surged through him. He seemed to stiffen and grow underneath me. He tossed his head like a bull. He pawed the ground like a stallion. He blew and he snorted like a whale. He let out a great eeyore that echoed around the estate. And then off he went. I went with him, but only just. I clung on round his neck. It was all I could do. Barnaby wasn't trotting. He wasn't cantering. He was galloping. He was fairly flying over the ground, his hoofbeats thundering. I had no time to think about falling off. No time to be frightened. I'd lost my reins by now. So there was no way I could guide him, but it didn't seem to matter. He knew the way. Within no time, I could see the crazy Cossacks up ahead, and Barnaby could see them too. He didn't need telling. He was after them. The rush of the wind on my face took my breath away. I was so happy, so exhilarated. I felt like whooping and cheering, but I couldn't find the voice to do it. All the time I was catching up with the crazy Cossacks. Nearer, nearer, nearer. Not one of them looked back. No one was expecting me. As I passed the crazy Cossacks one by one, all they could do was gape at me in sheer disbelief. But Marty Morgan and Barry were still out there in the lead, neck and neck, and were way ahead of me. I was coming up fast, but not fast enough. I could see the winning post now and the crowd leaping up and down, and Mum yelling louder than anyone. I don't know how I thought of it, because I was far too tired to think, but I breathed into Barnaby's ear and I hoped were the magic words. "Please, Barnaby, do it for Mr. Skip." They were magic, all right. Barnaby seemed to slip instantly up an even higher gear. He may have been puffing and blowing like an old steam engine, but he was going. We cruised past Marty and Barry, and as we passed them, I just smiled at them. It was the happiest smile of my entire life, and a smile that stayed with me all the way to the finishing post. I punched the air in triumph. I had in mind that as soon as Barnaby stopped, I would do a Frankie Dettori jump off. But Barnaby didn't stop. He charged straight on, scattering the cheering crowd as he went, and straight back towards his lockup. Just outside, he stopped very suddenly. Too suddenly. I went flying over his head and landed in a pile of bin bags. But luckily for me, they were full. So although I was shaken and a bit smelly, I wasn't at all hurt. I was still lying there in among the bin bags and trying to collect my thoughts when Mum and everyone came running. She helped me to my feet and made sure I was all right. We just hugged and cried and hugged some more. And And she wasn't the only one hugging me. It seemed everyone on the estate thought I was the bee's knees. Miss Munro from school was there. She hugged me too. Who didn't hug me? Well, the crazy Cossacks didn't. Marty Morgan certainly didn't. Instead, they hung around for a while, shaking their heads and looking all bewildered and sorry for themselves. Barry managed to mutter a "well done," which was as good as a dozen hugs to me. He even stayed behind and helped me towel Barnaby down and groom him. Then he said Barnaby could spend the rest of the day grazing with Dasher on the green if I wanted. We were walking Barnaby up there some time later when this big car came up alongside us and a young man leaned out and said, "Is that the super donkey that runs faster than horses?" "Yes," I replied. "Well, I'm from the newspaper. Can I have a photo and a bit of a chat?" It didn't take long. A couple of photos of Barnaby and me and a few questions about the race, and that was all. I told Mum about the reporter when I got home. We were having fish and chips again to celebrate. We sat there, Mum and me, in the kitchen, scoffing down our fish and chips and going over the race again and again. And all the time, Mr. Skip was watching us both. I couldn't stop looking at him. I just knew that somehow he had made it all happen. It was difficult with Mum there, but I felt I had to say thank you to him. I couldn't just sit there and say nothing. So after I'd said good night to Mum, I said it to him too. "Good night, Mr. Skip," I said, "and thanks." And I kissed him on both his pink cheeks. "What are you thanking him for?" Mum laughed. "It was Barnaby who won that race. Barnaby and you." "I can't explain it, Mum," I said. "I just think he's lucky for us somehow, that's all." "A sort of lucky mascot, you mean?" Mum said. "Something like that," I replied, and went off to bed. I lay there in the dark, wondering what would happen tomorrow or the next day. Knowing now for sure that Mr. Skip had already made one of my dreams come true, I knew that whatever happened next, Mr. Skip would be behind it. Somehow Mr. Skip would be pulling the strings. Barnaby and me, we were just puppets, but I didn't mind. I didn't mind at all. Thank you for listening, and thank you to my friends here, and look forward to seeing what happens in chapter 5.